Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to introduce Troy Jollimore as our speaker today. Troy received his PhD in philosophy from Princeton University in 1999 under the direction of Harry Frankfurt. He's professor of philosophy at Cal State University, Chico. He's the author of Love's Vision, Princeton 2011, and On Loyalty, Routledge 2012, and the editor of The Virtue of Loyalty from Oxford University Press 2024. His articles have appeared in Midwest Studies in Philosophy, Ethics, Synthesis, Canadian Journal of Philosophy, and elsewhere. He's also the author of 4 collections of poetry at Lake Scugog, okay, Earthly Delights, Tom Thompson and Purgatory, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Poetry, Syllabus of Errors, which was chosen by the New York Times as one of the 10 best poetry books of 2015. He's a formal external faculty fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center and was a 2013 Guggenheim Fellow. Please warmly welcome Troy.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. How is the volume? Is my mic on? And can everyone hear me okay?
You'll have to protect him.
I do. Okay. So if I start to get a little too quiet, feel free to just let me know that you can't hear me. If I wander outside the blue box, somebody tell me that I'm supposed to stay inside the blue box. Cool. All right. Yeah, thanks for coming, especially during your lunch hour. Really appreciate it. Should I go ahead? All right. Okay, so friendship and the good life obviously is a big title because it's got 2 subtopics and both of them are big topics in themselves. So I'm not going to be in any way able to talk about every aspect of either friendship or the good life, but there's one interesting place where I think they intersect that I'm going to be talking about today. There's other places where they intersect. I can't touch that either. My way of thinking about the good life, I should say to begin, draws a lot from Aristotle, Plato, the Stoics, the ancient philosophers in general. And in particular, one connection that you'll see is that I acknowledge some potential for conflict between my own self-interest and ethics, but I don't see them as radically opposed. And in fact, I think a lot of the time that they're mutually reinforcing. And today's talk is going to center more on the virtue side of things as far as the good life goes, rather than on the self-interest or happiness side. But happiness certainly comes into it in a way because, after all, we're talking about friendship. The particular virtues that will be most in question are, I think, 2 sets. First of all, integrity, especially doxastic or intellectual integrity, along with honesty, authenticity, and various truth-regarding virtues. And then second, the set that includes things like compassion, charity, generosity. Now, again, I don't take these virtues to be disconnected from happiness or even in competition with it at all. I think to be truly happy, we need a substantial degree of integrity. I think we need a certain amount of compassion. I think we need some of all those things. But again, there can be certain kinds of tensions. And today I'm going to explore one possible kind of tension and largely try to defuse it, I think. So friendship is an area where both of these, happiness and virtue, come together. In his essay on friendship, I want to start just with a nod to Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great American thinker. He says that friendship has 2 pillars. One of them is truth, as he says, and the other one is tenderness. So, and you can see how these both, I think, relate to the 2 sets of virtues I just mentioned, the truth stuff like integrity and honesty and so on, and the tenderness stuff connecting with things like compassion. So a friend for Emerson would be somebody who is honest with you and somebody who is tender with you, and you are tender with them. You treat them gently, lovingly, and so on. But then some people think, well, wait, can we do both of those at the same time? Is that possible? Some have suggested, in fact, that friendship is really not a friend of truth, but rather truth's enemy. When you love someone, and maybe, because romantic love is so passionate, I think friendship and romantic love is very closely connected anyway, but maybe because romantic love is so passionate, it's easier to see there. This is a popular, from my childhood, cartoon character. When you're in love with somebody romantically, you think all sorts of crazy things about them. You think they're just wonderful, right? You can't see them objectively at all, right? This is part of the mythos of romantic love. You think they're a skunk, and in fact, they're a cat, right? It can go that far. And something like this, I think, happens in friendship too, although it's not as blown up as it is with romantic infatuation. But it does seem like there's some part of this, and this again makes some philosophers worry that in committing ourselves to a friendship, to being somebody's friend, at the same time, you're committing yourself to being epistemically irresponsible, to not really scrutinizing the evidence as well as you might, and to potentially forming false beliefs and so on, inflated beliefs about your friend's virtue and goodness or something like that. So we're talking about a phenomenon called epistemic partiality, this being inclined to see the people you love in a positive light, give them the benefit of the doubt, think the best of them, and so on, maybe disregarding evidence that points in the other direction. And the contemporary discussion of this in the last 20 years or so has really come out of these two articles, Simon Keller's Friendship and Belief and Sarah Stroud's Epistemic Partiality in Friendship. So that's the phrase that gets used as the name of this phenomenon, though Keller's article came out a couple years beforehand. They're talking about essentially the same thing. I think that there's something right in what both Keller and Stroud are saying, and there's also something wrong. I think that they have a somewhat simplistic view of what goes on in friendship with respect to our epistemic conduct, about forming beliefs and so on. And that as a result, they exaggerate the conflict between friendship and intellectual integrity and other truth-regarding virtues. So yeah, there are, I'm not claiming that the friendship can never lead us astray this way. Clearly it does, and romantic love certainly sometimes does. But I don't think that the harmful versions of epistemic partiality are what friendship actually requires. And so I want to lay out some possibilities for other things that friends can do that would allow them to be good friends and to manifest the kind of epistemic partiality, even as they are also, at the same time, being epistemically responsible. So Keller's paper begins with an example drawn from the sitcom Friends, appropriately enough, in which Joey, if you've seen this show at some point, you might remember Joey is an aspiring actor. He's also not good at acting. And he's just been cast in a movie, and he's on a road trip with his friend Chandler, and he asks Chandler, is this going to be my big break, do you think? And they're playing this little game where you're supposed to ask the question and immediately answer it without stopping to think about it, which sort of guarantees that you'll say what you really think. And of course, Chandler says no, because he knows that Joey's not a good actor. And this really hurts Joey's feelings, and Joey feels, among other things, betrayed. So Keller thinks, in fact, that Chandler has done something wrong here. Chandler hasn't been a good friend in this moment. And it's not the fact of his being honest and saying what he really thinks, and Keller's very clear about this. It's the fact that he thinks it. As his friend, as Joey's friend, he should believe that Joey is about to have his big break, whatever the evidence might be. Now, I happen to think, first of all, that Keller's just wrong about that. That just goes too far. He's got good evidence again. Chandler has good evidence that Joey is not talented. I think it's crazy, and I just don't share Keller's intuition on this, that friendship would say that to be a good friend, he has to believe contrary to the evidence, right? But we could go that way, but that just takes all the interest in the way out of it. Let's talk in a more interesting case where somebody actually has talent, but they still might not succeed. So again, drawing from popular culture, I don't know how many of you have seen this lovely film, but if you haven't, go watch it. Alexander Payne's Sideways. Great film, right? Highly recommended by our audience here. Yes, thank you. It's a great film in many ways, including this. It's a wonderful portrait of friendship and a very nuanced portrait of friendship. So in this film, Paul Giamatti, the incredible actor Paul Giamatti, plays Miles. He's an aspiring novelist in this case, not an actor. And he's got a book, but it's not published yet. He's got the manuscript. It's very large. We're given to understand that it's very hard to read because it's serious literature, right? It's not genre fiction. It's not approachable to a lot of audiences. No publisher has taken it, and he's schlepping it around, and it's basically at the last publishing house. It's at the last chance, and he's waiting to hear from them. So this is part of the setup of the film. And he and Jack go on this road trip while this is happening, and his friend Jack, here they are together. This is a nice scene where Jack is actually giving him comfort and is saying to him all these things that are reassuring and so on. He doesn't say, as Keller apparently thinks he ought to say, I'm sure your book will get published. Well, he may say that at some point, but most of what he says doesn't take that. It's not about whether it will get published. It's about how good it is, whether or not it gets published, no matter what happens. So he reminds him that a lot of great writers were unpublished during their lives and very unsuccessful, that the publishing industry is unfair, they play it safe and so on. He expresses his own belief in Miles's talent. He also, he says, you're probably too talented to succeed. You're too good a writer. And he even finds beauty in Miles's complaints and laments. And then he says, he encourages him, you should just try again. If nobody takes this one, just write another one. Now, I want to just pause here and say, a lot of this stuff is also things that Chandler could have said to Joey, especially if we imagine that Joey was kind of a talented actor, right? You don't have to think your friend is about to have their big break, because you could say to them something like, the industry is really unfair. Not everybody succeeds. Lots of good people never get their big break, right? And this is connected to one of the points that I really want to bring out, and that'll come up, I think, in a couple different ways throughout the talk, which is that it's a mistake to think that what's going on in, again, what we're calling epistemic partiality, what goes on between friends in these contexts, it's a mistake to think that that comes down to these particular facts. What really matters are not particular isolated facts. What really matters is the interpretation of the facts, or the way we put facts together into a story. So we could acknowledge that Miles's book probably won't get published and Joey probably won't have his big break, and still use that as part of a story according to which and in which they are good, admirable people worthy of our friendship, and so on. So I think that these examples show a couple of important things. First of all, even though I don't think we're required to think of our friends as talented or skilled. This is, again, talking about things like artistic talent and stuff like that. It might be different when it comes to morality, as we will in a moment. But I don't think we're required to think of our friends as talented or skilled, but it is good when we can do so. And I think friendship does nudge us in that direction to some degree. At the very least, we should be looking at them with a kind of generous, charitable vision and looking for the goodness in what they do that maybe isn't immediately apparent. Because sometimes, especially when like somebody's not just artistically talented, but innovative, it's hard to see that right off. It takes effort to see that. And then the second thing is, again, what I was just saying about giving them the benefit of the doubt, that it's not being committed to some particular factual claim. It's about a kind of a story or an overall set of facts that forms a narrative. Friendship is a matter of interpretation, I think. It's a matter of storytelling. And that's a theme I'm certainly going to come back to. Aesthetic particularism, what do I mean by that? Well, suppose that Miles is, suppose that one of Miles's friends is asked, well, is he a good writer? Right, this novel, it's unreadable. It's so hard, I hear, is he really a good writer? Isn't there a reason why it's not getting published? What might this person say? Well, we've already seen some of the things that a person might say, the kind of things that Jack actually says to Miles. Publishing world is unfair, right? Stuff like that. Many great writers unsuccessful, and so on. But there's also a very interesting kind of aesthetic argument that can be used here, which again involves acknowledging some facts, but working towards a certain interpretation of the facts. So what we can do a lot of the times in this case is look at certain features of the artwork in question, the novel in Miles's case, the unpublished novel, and acknowledge that, yes, these are features which are often false, but in this case, they're not. What we're appealing to here is what I'm calling aesthetic particularism, which is basically, do I have a slide on this? Yeah, essentially, that there are no universal ironclad principles in aesthetics, that there's always exceptions. And in particular, that particular features that can make an artwork worse, or in many cases even have the general tendency to make an artwork worse, sometimes make it better. So in this case, for instance, Miles's book is difficult. Some would even say perhaps it's unreadable. Well, is that the way we should describe it? Is it in fact the case that it's sophisticated and challenging? It makes a great difference whether we describe it one way or the other. And a lot of aesthetic controversies depend on precisely this question of interpretation. Many bad novels are hard to read, but Ulysses is hard to read. Gravity's Rainbow is hard to read. Many bad movies, are very, very slow. But Antonioni's L'Avventura is very slow. Tarkovsky's Stalker, all of Tarkovsky's films are very slow. Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia is very slow. These are all great films. Early audiences who saw Godard's Breathless in the 60s, a lot of them thought, oh my God, this guy knows, he doesn't even know the basic principles of film editing. He has no idea what he's doing. No, what he was doing was extremely innovative, which is why people didn't recognize it. In much the same way, a lot of people who saw early film noir thought, oh, this is terrible. These people, these screenwriters don't know how it works. At the end of the film, the criminals get away unpunished and innocent people suffer. And in some cases are put away in prison even for crimes that they didn't commit. Well, what kind of universe is that? Well, it's the kind of universe we live in, actually, which is one of the great things about film noir, that it actually describes features of the world that up to that point people weren't putting into movies. But again, people thought of this as both an aesthetic flaw and in that case as a moral flaw as well. Some music is bad because it's primitive or simplistic or performed by musicians who don't really, that don't have virtuosic skills. But those very features make a lot of early rock and roll or punk rock truly great, right? And so on. Those are some examples. I could go on and on with examples, but that would take up the whole talk. I just want to give you the idea of the kind of feature that I'm talking about. I think of them as flip-floppers in a sense. They're features that can go in either direction. They can make something a lot better in the right circumstances. They can make something a lot worse in the wrong sort of circumstances. So again, what we're looking at here, and I'm going to use this in a second as an analogy for the moral case, which is what I'm really interested in, because again, this is really about virtue. But we're looking at this sort of case where, again, you acknowledge a lot of the accusations or a lot of the factual claims. Yes, this work does have these features, but you deny that it means what the critic thinks it means. In this case, even though this work has those features, it's not a problem. It's not a defect. It's a feature, not a bug, as people sometimes like to say now, right? In fact, it might even be that the fact that this person was able to take a feature that is ordinarily a bad-making feature and make it into a good-making feature is actually evidence of their artistic talent or even their artistic genius. All right, so how about the moral case? Well, guess what? Morality is as complex as aesthetics, or so I think anyway. If you want ironclad universal principles in aesthetics, I don't think you'll find them. Will you find them in morality? Maybe a few, I don't know, maybe not very many, I don't think. Not very many, if any. And so we're going to find something similar going on here. So let's imagine a moral case. Suppose that Jeff is Randy's friend and he hears it, that Randy has done some bad thing. And he thinks to himself, Randy is my friend, he would never do that. Right? That can't be right, something like that. But it turns out a lot of people saw it. Clearly it happened and so on, right? What do I do now as Randy's friend? How do I assimilate this knowledge that Randy did this bad thing? Well, there's a number of options here I'm going to skip over for reasons of time because I want to get to the more interesting ones. There's various ways that Jeff could think about, he wasn't fully responsible. There's an excuse, right? Excusing conditions, et cetera. Doesn't really reflect his character. So there's other stuff there, but I'm going to skip over that stuff. I want to talk about the kind of case that's more analogous to the one I was just talking about in aesthetics. Like, I'm going to talk about really two kind of phenomena here. That's the first one, but they're also related. So morality is complex. Every kind of action that is ordinarily morally wrong is justifiable in some set of circumstances. Well, again, that's a strong claim. I probably don't want to be committed to defending that. So let's just say most. That'll be enough to make the point. It opens up the possibility that maybe Randy did do this thing that a lot of people saw him do. Sounds like he did. A lot of people saw it, but it wasn't wrong in this set of circumstances. So, what did Randy do? Well, okay, he told a lie. We all know that telling lies is sometimes justifiable, sometimes even admirable in the right circumstances. When we're kids, we're told that that's not true. You may have had your parents say to you, don't ever lie. Lying's wrong. Lying's always wrong. But that's because you had a little kid brain that wasn't ready yet to hear the actual truth of it, which was lying is usually wrong and it can be very serious and bad, but sometimes it's actually the right thing to do because the world's complicated. Okay, maybe it wasn't a lie. Maybe he committed a theft. Well, what were the circumstances of the theft? What did he steal? Who did he steal it from? What was going on? We all, I hope, recall from Victor Hugo's book, Les Miserables, the case of Jean Valjean, who is sent to prison for stealing a loaf of bread to feed a starving family. I would not consider that to be a serious moral wrong. I'm not really sure. I think that's wrong at all. I'd have to hear more about the details maybe. But if that was really his only option and they really were starving, I'm pretty sure I'd be inclined to go with that. In fact, you might say, yeah, okay, if that was the nature of the crime, then nobody would have said that Randy did a wrong thing to begin with. So this wouldn't even have happened, right? But actually, I think there are a lot of people today who would take a really hard line on that sort of thing. I think there are all sorts of people around who would quite happily press charges against a desperate homeless person who stole food from a store. But anyway, we can make the situation more complicated, right? To the point where we're not exactly sure which way we should go on it. Again, we're looking at flip-floppers here, right? That's the kind of thing we're looking for. Suppose Randy wasn't himself desperate. He wasn't stealing the food for himself. Suppose that he stole for somebody who was. Suppose that Randy he has really highly developed computer hacking skills. And he hacked into a bank's system and transferred some money out of their accounts and diverted it to a charity that provides clean drinking water for people in sub-Saharan Africa, or homes for the homeless here in the US, right? Whatever it is. Tell the story any way you want. Is that wrong? I'm not sure. I think it's actually a very complicated case. And in a way, that's part of the point. I would be inclined, if I heard about this in the abstract, to think, yeah, kind of wrong, but again, I'm not totally sure. If one of my friends did it, that might change how I thought about it. It would also change how I thought about them, perhaps, but not in the simple way of thinking, oh, it turns out they're a bad person. I think we would be much more nuanced in our reaction to that sort of thing. So that's an action, and I think that action cases here are interesting, but I think what's more interesting is, again, features, or here are character traits. I think that there are many character traits which are like the aesthetic features I mentioned earlier that are flip-floppers. They can be good or they can be bad, and there can be very reasonable and also very heated disagreement about which ones they are. Let's be some examples of those, these features that walk the tightrope. Consider the fine line between being a pessimist or a cynic, which many people think are bad things to be, and being simply hard-headed and realistic. Being hard-headed and realistic, probably a good thing in the world that we live in. A lot of people think that pessimism or cynicism, I don't go that far. I'm not cynical. I'm just hard-headed and realistic, right? Or I'm hard-headed, but I'm not hard-hearted. That seems like an important distinction. And yet, in practice, the distinction can be pretty fine. What about cruelty? Cruelty is clearly bad, right? Cruelty is not the kind of thing that could ever be good. Could cruelty ever be called for? Well, if you believe in the phenomenon known as tough love, then you believe that there are some cases in which the right response to somebody, maybe somebody you love, your child or something who is having addiction issues, the right response is to be cruel, to be kind. Now, this has to be a real thing because there's a song about it. And if you know this song, it's really catchy. It's a really catchy song. But I happen to believe, that's a joke, but that cruel to be kind is actually a thing, that sometimes it's the right thing to do. And I've known people who have had to do this, and they've said to me, yeah, that's not just like a casual name. Like, it felt like I was being cruel. It was really hard to do. I didn't enjoy it because it felt like I was actually being cruel to this person I loved. Similarly, we generally think that being nasty is not a good thing to be. It shouldn't be nasty. But of course, a few years back, when a certain presidential candidate referred to his rival Hillary Clinton as a nasty woman, a number of women started to find ways of making the point that in an oppressive patriarchy, it might not be only reasonable, but admirable to be nasty, or at least nasty in the right way to the right people. Think about a person who's so strongly committed to justice that in their eyes, nothing else matters. Does that sort of person sound like a moral hero or a frightening vigilante? When I first think about the description, I'm sort of inclined to think that sounds good. They sound heroic, right? So, okay, then let's think about, here's a case, Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry character. Some of you are too young to be familiar with this, but hopefully some of you at least sort of know. He's this cop who's willing to bend the rules and even break them to, in the pursuit of what he considers to be justice. And in fact, I think, in some of the films, we are meant to admire him, at least to a degree, but I think he's pretty scary. If you're either not familiar with that or you think that, in fact, he's heroic and you admire him, think of the 9/11 terrorists, right? Somebody like that. Because surely that's how they saw themselves, as people who are so committed to doing what's right and bringing about justice that they were willing to do anything. That's scary to me. Or another example, somebody a little more sympathetic to me, if you happen to see the movie True Grit a few years ago, the character of Maddie Ross, pursuing justice as she sees it. Her father's been killed. The murderer is still out there. But in the course of pursuing it, and there's something admirable about her devotion to justice and to her father, but she does some pretty questionable things and becomes in some ways a pretty scary person. So we're talking about idealists here, and with idealism itself, the word has a positive connotation for us a lot of the time. But in fact, idealism, if we think of it especially as, doing a certain thing, no matter the cost, no matter what, can become frightening. It can be taken too far. So here's an idealist that we talk about a lot, Socrates. Many of his fellow Athenians saw Socrates as unforgivably rude and abrasive, and also, of course, as socially dangerous and disruptive, pernicious, harmful to the youth, etc. So much so that they eventually put him to death. We philosophers tend to see him on the whole as an honest, courageous person who is brave enough to always speak his mind, even when it cost him his life. People who are ready to speak difficult truths are nearly always labeled by some as rude, troublesome, annoying, and so on. And here, to name a couple contemporaries or near contemporaries, I would name the journalist Christopher Hitchens and the activist Greta Thunberg. Thunberg, of course, is another example of this sort of Matty Ross, Dirty Harry type character who, had the ideal. They seem to be willing to do whatever it is to pursue that ideal. And by the way, and I want to be clear about this, I'm not saying that you have to think that all three of these people or all of my examples are good, because I've offered some bad examples as well as some good ones. Hitchens is a questionable case in my own mind. I admire him in a lot of ways. I certainly don't think everything he said was true. And even when you read, there's some nice essays out there, like by Steve Wasserman, who is Christopher Hitchens' friend, where he talks about him. The feelings about this guy are very complicated. It's a nice actual, if I have more time, I'd read some selections from that essay because it's an actual friend of this person writing about their complicated relationship with this person. So let me just say, instead, you can seek it out for yourself, but it's clear that Wasserman was able to see Hitchens' flaws and limitations and appreciate them, and that didn't get in the way of their friendship, but it's not as if he had a rosy view. And yet, despite that, he clearly admired him very much as somebody who had principles and was dedicated to important values. And in a way, if we have trouble making up our minds about some of these people, again, we find ourselves sort of flip-flopping between good and bad evaluations. That kind of furthers the point that I'm trying to get at. One last example, another example from the movies, and again, I hope some of you have seen this movie, A, because it's a wonderful movie, but B, it's such a nice illustration of the point that I'm trying to get at in this part of the talk, and that is Walter Sobchak in The Big Lebowski. If you've seen it, then you know. There's no doubt that Walter is a seriously flawed human being. He is loud, blustering, self-righteous, monumentally confident in his own intuitions and judgments to the point of arrogance and closed-mindedness. He is constantly angry, he is frequently petulant, and he's not only willing but eager to draw out a gun when he's challenged or upset. He's basically a big baby, a baby with a gun. He's a pretty scary guy. So why do his friends, and in particular his friend the Dude, who we see down here, and here they are together here, why would somebody like the Dude stand by him? Well, they're friends, of course, obviously, right? But what's going on in the friendship? I think what's not going on, and this is important, is that the Dude is just sort of holding his nose and ignoring all these things about Walter in order to still be his friend. I think it's something much more interesting than that. I think that what's happening is that the Dude is able to see Walter's flaws and faults and see what is good in them in a way that only a friend could. There's no way a stranger could see this. He sees that Walter's frequent rages and angry tantrums are really expressions of frustration at a morally disappointing universe where innocent people suffer all the time for no good reason. Walter is certainly obsessive and tone deaf in his insistence on comparing everything he sees with Vietnam, his experience there. But the Dude sees that the impassioned outrage that he directs both towards that war and towards contemporary goings-on is heartfelt and genuine. And if it's not always justified, it's at least well-intentioned. Yes, he overreacts. I just showed a couple brief scenes, right? He overreacts when a fellow bowler's toe goes over the line. He pulls out a gun. He's acting ridiculously, yes. But as the Dude well knows, this is an expression of Walter's terror of destructive chaos, his longing for order and his perception that the beliefs that make peaceful society possible are no longer being widely observed or treated with the respect that they deserve. And at the end of the film, when Walter makes a ridiculous, hilariously inappropriate speech, again about Vietnam, etc., while trying to cast their friend Donnie's ashes into the sea, The wind blows them back to land and mostly into the dude's face. The dude does express frustration and even some anger, which has clearly been building up over some period of time. But the scene ends in this really moving moment of them hugging and consoling each other, because the dude sees what nobody else really could, and what a stranger certainly could not, that beneath this frightening exterior and this often embarrassing observable behavior, Walter is a child who has just lost a friend. He's in grief. And of course, there's a very intimate connection between grief and love. Now, I want to be clear on this. I don't think that the dude thinks that everyone should see Walter this way, or that everyone even could. It's only within friendships that we could really see people like this. And I also don't mean to suggest that this sort of sympathetic and open-minded vision makes it impossible for the dude to see the other side of Walter, as if he could only see the good parts. Walter is in many ways a child. And all the traits that I've mentioned in one way or another speak to this. His fear of disorder, his longing for universal rules is probably the most obvious example. Children are by nature sympathetic because they're so vulnerable. They call forth our compassion. But children are also unpredictable and dangerous. And this is especially true of children like Walter, who inhabit the bodies of grown-up men. So what friendship enables the dude to do, and I think requires that he do, is to see both of these sides of Walter at once. And I think that this is a mode of vision that is peculiar to friendship. If it's ever possible to see a non-friend in this way, I think it's a very rare thing. It would only be under very unusual circumstances. So I want now to turn to a slightly different phenomenon, but related to that. I've been talking again about ways that we began with this scenario, right? You hear that a friend has done something bad, and I've been talking about ways you might respond to that news as a friend. To this point, none of the possible ways of responding I've really talked about. Well, I focused on the one, right? So it doesn't require you to change your own views. Like in the bread stealing case, for instance, you might already have been inclined to to view the act of stealing bread to feed a starving family as morally forgivable, morally admirable, even, the right thing to do in the right circumstances. But then there's this also very interesting kind of case where you do change your views. At first, you're inclined to sort of agree with the accusing crowd and judge your friend to have done something seriously wrong. But then you start to think about it. You think, well, yeah, but this is Larry who did this, right? This is Walter or whatever. Would he really do such a terrible thing if it really were all that terrible? And you start to look at your own views, your own values, the presuppositions that you're bringing to it. What is it about me? Where do I get the ideas on which I'm basing my evaluation of this action as wrong? And in the end, and obviously this is not always what happens, and it shouldn't be always what happens, but in some cases, you end up changing your views. You change your values as the result of the self-criticism and self-scrutiny and reflection that is instigated by the encounter with the friend and what you first considered their wrongdoing. So let's imagine one more case. Suppose that Greta, and I'm naming her after Greta Thunberg, Greta has taken part in a very disruptive protest. Greta's friend Beth is by nature quite cautious and conservative. She looks down on behavior like this. She thinks that, yes, these ideas have to be expressed, but there's better ways to do it. This just creates social chaos and disorder. It frightens people. It amps up the level of tension out there. It's also just childish, she thinks. It's inherently sort of performative and provocative. And there's just better ways to communicate these dissatisfactions. That's what she's always thought. But of course, things are different for her now, because now her close friend Greta has gone and participated in one of these. And if they really have a close friendship, I don't think she's going to just criticize Greta in the same way, break off the friendship or whatever. That could happen, but I think that shows it was already a weakness in the friendship to begin with. I also don't think she's just going to shrug and say, oh, let it go, whatever, I don't care. She can't do that because this is somebody she really cares about. And this is going to make her doubt and question her own beliefs and values and assumptions. So this is part of a larger phenomenon of friendship that I think is very important, and it has to do with friendship's transformative potential, the way it changes us. So Julia Annis, for instance, a philosopher, says that on the Aristotelian conception, and I take it she's very sympathetic to this conception, a friend is someone who, quote, makes the same choices as his friend and finds the same things pleasant as his friend. Now, I want to immediately say I don't want to push that too far. It's not my view, and I don't think it's Julia Annis's view or Aristotle's, that to be somebody's friend, even their close friend, you have to agree on everything. In fact, I think that disagreements often make friendships really interesting. But I do think that when somebody is my friend, there will be a tendency for us to grow together, especially in the places that really matter. We can disagree on trivial things. We can maybe have some deep disagreements, but there's a limit to how many I think you can have. And I think those deep disagreements, there's going to be this tendency, like I said, to sort of move to overcome them to some degree. If I'm really spending a lot of time with this person, if I really care about them. It doesn't have to happen. It's probably some friends end up, not really growing together at all. But I think those friendships will probably be the exception rather than the rule, because I think that where my friends' values conflict with mine, my knowledge of this difference gives me reason to reconsider my own views and to see my friends' views in a more positive light. So to quote Aristotle himself, he says, from each other, friends take the mold of characteristics they approve. This is a big idea in Aristotle's view of friendship and how it works. In a related vein, Talbot Brewer writes of love that love is, quoting here, a mutual and continuously reiterated process that involves a readiness on the part of each person to be guided by the example of the other in articulating an evolving understanding of the human good. And Alexander Nehamas, this is one of my favorite books on friendship. I love this book. Alexander Nehamas writes that friendship, quote, changes us in ways we cannot anticipate completely. And it also changes our friends, because ideally our interaction, which consists in interpretation, establishes new and previously unknown features of theirs and gives them back to us and perhaps to the world with a new face. So I want, while I have this slide up, to call attention to this little claim that's sort of buried in there that I think is very interesting. Right? It's kind of a bold claim, even though it's a bit buried. Our interaction, which consists in interpretation. That's a large part of the thing that I've been trying to get at today. I'd suggested early on that friendship, as I said, was a matter of interpretation or of storytelling. And I hope maybe now it's become more clear what I mean by that. We tell stories about our friends and about ourselves and our friendships, and we can choose to tell these things in different ways. I think that when we do so, we have to accommodate the facts. And this, again, is part of where I disagree with people like Keller and Stroud, who seem to think, look, we can toss out some of the facts if they're inconvenient to being somebody's friend. I don't think we get to do that. Facts are facts. I think we have to acknowledge them. But facts can mean different things depending on context. Now, even here, and I want to be clear about this, I don't think it's an anything goes kind of thing. I don't think being somebody's friend means I'm determined to tell a story that puts them in a positive light no matter what. Because it has to be allowable that at a certain point, and with this, even Keller and Stroud, by the way, would agree, that at a certain point, you just have to throw up your hands and say, they're just a bad person. I can't be their friend, or something like that. It has to be possible to get to that point. Otherwise, you're truly irrational and in a dangerous way. But I also think that there's a lot of open space in which there is room for interpretation. And part of what makes this reasonable and not a bad phenomenon is that in a lot of these cases, now this sort of depends on an undefended assumption. I don't have time to defend it here, right? My undefended assumption I'll just sort of mention is, I think that in general, we are too negative towards other people. We're too judgmental. I think that the general tendency is we judge other people too harshly, and rather than, as some people tend to think, we are too nice to other people. Now, the one area I think where we don't tend to do that is with our friends. I think that with our friends, because of epistemic partiality, we tend to view our friends in a positive light. So I think my deepest disagreement, in a way, with people like Keller and Stroud, if I'm understanding their view right, is that they sort of see the epistemic practices involved in friendship as kind of a deviation from the norm, where the norm is impersonal, detached, not really trying very hard to understand other people. This isn't necessarily how they would characterize the norm, but I tend to see the norm as what we do with a lot of people most of the time as being pretty dismissive and pretty quick. I hear something about somebody, I think, yeah, they did a terrible thing. They're probably a lousy person, and that's it, right? End of story. I don't go into it. Whereas again, if it's my friend, I wouldn't stop there. I'd look into it. I'd find out what's going on. How could you do that? What were your reasons? What were you thinking? I'd find out all about the circumstances. I would talk to them. I would try to understand. If they said things that didn't seem convincing, I would try to imagine, well, how might that be convincing? This again is my friend. They saw it as convincing. They're seeing something I don't seem to be seeing. What's going on? So I want to sort of flip the story in that way. I think that the epistemic practices that attach to our friendships and our relationships with people we love are actually closer to being the way we should approach things. And if anything, it would be good to the extent that we could, start doing that with everybody, including strangers. Trying to understand people, giving them the benefit of the doubt, right? That's where I guess this talk comes back to compassion and something like that, which I mentioned at sort of the outset of the talk. We already have a natural compassion that we tend to feel, I think, towards our friends and people that we love because we see them in their full humanity. I think it would be nice, and maybe more than just nice, but maybe nice is a nice word that we philosophers don't use enough, you know. I think it would be nice to try to treat everybody that way, again, to the extent that we could. That's okay. Somebody's calling to tell me how much they agree with me.
It's an opportunity to be nice.
It's an opportunity to be nice. I think that, I mean, I think I'm going to skip the last part, which sort of says in a different way, I think, just what I just said, because I do want to leave time for questions. So maybe I'll just skip over a couple good people and get to my ending image. I just love the affinity between these two images, two pear-shaped men embracing. Why don't I stop there and see if anybody has any comments or questions and we can have discussion about it.
Are you done?
I think I'm done.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was great. That was
Oh,
great.
thanks.
I've got the mic, so we're recording. So I'll bring this over and you can ask your question. Any questions for Troy? Okay, I'll come up. I'll come up to you. Okay, cool. You just hold it. Just hold.
I was curious,
Oh, no
almost
worries.
in passing, you said that there's a relation that you see between grief and love. Could you talk about that a little bit, what you see?
Yeah. You know, I wrote a paper on grief a long time ago that was partly about this. And I was defending grief against the accusations that some philosophers had made that basically grief was simply a form of suffering. And like all suffering, it's a bad thing. And so we should try to avoid it. So if there's some way to not feel grief, like take a pill or something, and there's no grief, that you should do that. And I think that I thought at the time and still think that's just a very wrong-headed way to think about grief. And partly, so I was defending grief as kind of an epistemic state, that it actually involves knowledge. If your best friend died or somebody you really loved died and you didn't feel any pain, it would mean that you hadn't really grasped it, right? You hadn't really gotten the fact that they had died. So I was trying to develop this link between the feeling aspect of emotions and the epistemic aspect, which I think are really tied tightly together. And part of that view, I think, is that for me, this also comes out of reading Proust. It's really big in Proust. It's all over Proust, actually. Grief and love are so tied closely together because, first of all, the obvious point, I guess, we only grieve the people we love, I think. We only really feel that pain if it's somebody that meant something to you. And of course, one thing that sometimes happens, and I've heard about these cases, you probably have too, is that a person doesn't really realize it until the person dies, and then they feel this incredible grief. And then they're discovering something about themselves. Oh my God, this person really meant a lot to me. I didn't really get it, So grief is a wonderful, if I can use the word wonderful to describe grief, which is a little weird, but it's a wonderful occasion for self-knowledge. The philosopher Michael Cholby writes a little about this, quite interesting work. But beyond that, I just think that it's a fact about us that grief and love, they're very tightly closed together. I think that grief is the appropriate thing that we do and rightly do, have reason to do, when somebody you love dies. And there's some sense, again, this goes back to sort of the final parts of this paper, that It should sort of be ideally that we feel that way whenever anybody dies. But of course, that's impossible, right? It's impossible because we don't have the capacities to attach to that many people or feel that much or imagine that much. And of course, it would just make it impossible to live. You know, you'd be grieving all the time because lots of people die every day. So we're not set up for very good sort of biological, et cetera, reasons to grieve everybody's death. But there are some people, if we have the sort of life in which there are some people who we truly love, then there are some people whose deaths are really recognized by us on an emotional level. And they're recognized by us, I think, when we feel grief at their passing.
Questions? More other questions? Yeah, great.
I would kind of wanted to go back to the thing with like Joey and Chandler. It kind of made me think of like, okay, sometimes I might tell my friends sort of like a white lie, you know, like about their outfit or like about their hair. And sometimes I feel kind of bad about that, but I tell them that because I want to be supportive, like about what they're wearing or something like that.
Yeah.
But like, do you think it's more important as a friend to be truthful about what I think, or do you think it's more important to be supportive?
It's a great question. Yeah. So it really gets to this idea again from Ralph Waldo Emerson, you know, there's the two pillars. I don't know if pillars is the word he uses. I'm not sure he did, but that's, I picked up that somewhere anyway, that these two pillars of truth, these two pillars of friendship, truth and tenderness. What do you do when they conflict? I tend, and this is partly just an expression or a reflection of my own philosophical temperament, I tend to think there's no general rule. You probably saw already, you got a sense already, sort of I tend to think this about things. I doubt that it's always the case that we should tell the truth, and I doubt that it's always the case that we shouldn't, right? I think it's going to have to depend on the details of the case. And even then, if you said, okay, then in what way does it depend on the details of the case, right? I could, for instance, I'm not going to, I could say, well, I guess I end up being a utilitarian, so whatever makes them the most happy or something, but that's not me. I'm not a utilitarian. I'm a particularist, right? And so I'm going to say, well, you know, even that can't be determined in advance. Aristotle, as so often, is closest to the truth here, right? We look at the details of the case and then we use our practical wisdom. We invoke our, you know, we employ our phronesis, assuming we have some, hopefully we do. And we try to figure out in that case what's better. Because I think it's a genuinely hard question. You know, in the Joey and Chandler case again, and in Keller's treatment of it, Keller is clear that it's not just the fact that Chandler is honest with Joey and says, I don't think this will be your big break. That's the problem. The real problem is with what he thinks, right? If he had told a white lie to preserve his feelings, but still on the interior felt like or thought he's not going to succeed, in Keller's view, that's already problematic. But I think, you know, and I disagree with that, you know, as I said. But I'm certainly willing to say that although it's well within Chandler's rights, and indeed, in a way, within his obligations as a responsible epistemic agent to realize Joey is never going to succeed in all likelihood, he doesn't have to say that. And if he does say it, he doesn't have to be mean about it, right? There's a number of options here. Part of me thinks it would be best for him to keep that view inside and not say it at all. And to say, yes, I think it will, or there's a good chance. Or maybe something more like, again, you know, the movie industry's tough, man. You're great, and I really love you, and I love your work, but I just don't know if you'll ever, just because, you know, plan for failure, because that's what happens to most people, right? Joey, as somebody who's almost certainly not going to succeed, probably needs to hear that at some point. Maybe just not at this moment, too. Maybe it's a matter of timing in part. He's off on this trip to go do his, you know, be in this movie. Maybe now is not the time to hear it. But probably at some point, even if we're just thinking about what's best for the friend, because they're our friends, so we love them. So we want what's best for them. We probably need to hit them with the truth to some degree. And yet I also think that, as I said, you know, there are nice ways of doing that, and there are mean ways of doing that. And one thing that I've observed, you know, with my own eyes in certain friendships, is a person who accepts that view that I just stated, which I think is true, but then sort of uses it as an excuse for actual cruelty of the bad sort. They say, well, I got to be honest with my friend. They need to hear it. I love him, blah, blah. Okay, fine. And then they say it in this way that's really going to hurt the friend's feelings. And rather than thinking hard about, how can I tell them this truth in a way that is not going to cause unnecessary distress? Maybe it's going to cause some distress no matter what, right? The truth can be hard. My tendency on the whole tends to be honest with people, especially people you love, but not without limits. And I do think that when we're being honest, we really have to think about, how this is going to affect the other person and how we can articulate it in a way that is genuinely kind to them. So that's a very vague answer in a way, but it's also the way I tend to think about things, not just when I'm writing philosophy or whatever, but in my actual life where I'm so lucky. I get to like use the stuff I write about in actual life because I write about friendship and love and so on. I have friends who are doing all this metaphysics stuff. They never get to use what they write about. So I feel really lucky that way. So that's how I tend to think about it anyway.
Time for one or two more questions. One more question. Maybe let's make this the last question.
Thank you so much for coming out here today to present to all of us. I really loved what you had to say.
Thanks.
When you were talking about, friendship and how we should, expand that to more people, and as a society, we should try to treat more people as if our close friends. And then when you were answering the question about compassion and love, you talked about how there's this mechanism where maybe that's not a good idea because there's people dying every day, and we can't extend that compassion and love to everybody. Where do you find that line personally? Like, how do you practice what you preach, but then also don't get bogged down by all the suffering of millions of people on this planet?
Oh man, what a great question. That is such a great question. I wish I had an answer for you that was as good as the question, because I don't know how to do that. I'm just muddling through, like everybody else. And I feel like it's easy to, as I'm writing a philosophical essay or standing up here talking about it in an abstract way, to talk about that sort of thing as if, yeah, that's what we do and, no problem, right? In real life, it's so hard because I do feel like we were having sort of a dark discussion as people were filing in just before we started. And, it's dark times we live in. We all know this. On the other hand, times are always dark. Like no matter, you can look at any historical age, any moment, whatever, when people would say, oh, things were great then. And somewhere in the world, terrible things were happening. People were suffering in all sorts of ways. That is just a given. It's a given partly because of how many people there are and the nature of human life and experience. It's just always going to be true that at any given moment, not just somebody, but large numbers of people are going to be going through terrible things. And there's no way we could possibly really imagine it, which in a way is good because, again, it would incapacitate us. On the other hand, I think that as human beings, we have such this goes back to the very beginning of the talk when I at least mentioned self-interest, right? As human beings, we naturally have such a deeply instilled and automatically programmed interest in our own happiness that we can take that incapacity and sort of run with it and push it even further, right? So rather than trying to say, well, I'm going to imagine as well as I can, and I'm going to try to take in as much of the world as I can, ouch, that's painful. Let's not do that. I'm going to sort of retreat into myself, and I'll have a few friends and me, all of whom are kind of doing well, hopefully, and that's it, right? And that's the sort of place where I feel like friendship in a way can get dangerous. Like I don't want to, one of the dangers of a talk like this or of some of my work, I think, is I can give an overly rosy view of friendship as this wonderful thing with no danger. It's going to make you a better person and so on. I think it can make us better people, as I discussed. I think it can make us bigger. It can lead us towards truth. It can do all sorts of wonderful things. It can also do the opposite. And we can have bad friends who make us worse people. We can misjudge them and think that they're good, but they're not. This process I've talked about of reflecting and scrutinizing your own values and so on, it can go in the other direction. You can get it wrong. A friend can do something bad. You can say, yeah, maybe that is okay. And it's not okay, but they're your friend, so now you're a worse person. But then also in the other way that I was just talking about, like it's so natural for, even if we manage to avoid all that, there's such a natural desire to sort of retreat into a small life and surround yourself with a few people you really love, especially people who are already happy and doing well. And so you don't have to worry about them or feel bad, and they can help you if you have trouble, right? And just say, to hell with the rest of the world. I don't care. Yeah, it's a mess out there, but most of those people are bringing it on themselves, or whatever story you tell yourself about why it's okay, you know. And I'm just going to stay here at home with my friends and we'll have fun. And the really hard part, I think for me, well, it's all hard parts, but the really hard part, even harder than all the other hard parts, is that there's something right about that. And there's also something really dangerous about that. Like, we have to do that to some extent or we go crazy. And also, I think we deserve to do that to some extent. Like, I think people do deserve to be happy. And if you're one of the people for whom right now your life is going well and you can be happy, I sort of think, hey man, soak that up. You know, it doesn't last forever. Enjoy it. But no, I really think that, like, because you're down the road at some point, you're going to be one of the ones that things aren't going well for, you know? So people should get to be happy when they can. And yet the line between being happy and enjoying it and becoming callous and indifferent to other people's suffering is so fine that we often don't notice when we're crossing it. So this is a really long way of saying, I don't know, but I feel you, you know, you and I have the same question and I'd like to get a little clearer on it before I die. It's one of my aspirations. So thanks.
Great.
I just wanted to make one other comment. My
Yeah,
kid's
thanks.
mom, after she and I split up, my kid's mom used to call me up and cuss me out. And my friends are saying, well, what are you letting her do that for? I thought, well, she's got maybe something legitimate to say, right? And then I finally got it. And next time she called, I apologized to her. And I said, I want to apologize to you for allowing you to abuse me. And she said, what? I said, no, I apologize. And I'm going to have a boundary here. If you're abusive, I'm not going to participate anymore.
That's nice.
So,
Yeah, that's
but
good.
It was the kindest thing I could do,
Yeah, right.
you know?
Yeah,
So, anyway,
yeah, that's good. I like that. Thank you.
Let's
so-
give it, Troy, thanks, everybody. Thanks, Troy.
Thanks for having me and thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Troy.
Yeah.